I, Sarai, have been through a lot. Abram has put me through a lot, in fact, and our relationship has not always been easy, added to which I bear the curse of barrenness, opening me up to ridicule and gossip. I married Abram young, full of promise and excitement. Back then we had a sense of adventure and of God's calling to leave our families and go to, well, no one was just sure, a land God would show us if we stepped out in faith. And we believed God had given us a promise that our offspring would become a great nation through which the whole world would be blessed. Grand dreams and noble goals stirred our young hearts. But I had this sinking feeling, as month after month I hoped and waited and believed I might get pregnant, and month after month found that I wasn't. It's hard to keep getting your hopes up only to have them dashed, isn't it? Maybe we heard God wrong. Maybe it's wrong to hope. The journey with Abram was not easy, and at one point we fled a deadly famine and traveled through Egypt. Abram was afraid because, and this was painful, he was afraid not for me and my well-being, but that because I'm said to be so beautiful, the Egyptians would see me, want me, and kill him to get me. So to save his own life, he pretended I was his sister and gave me to Pharaoh as some kind of concubine, where I lived as his mistress. Was this all I was worth? Sleeping with Pharaoh to save Abram's life? Is this how the promise of God was going to be fulfilled? I felt like I was losing my life. Abram did nothing. But God saw my misery and acted, inflicting Pharaoh's household with a plague. And when Pharaoh discovered Abram's cover-up, he rebuked him and sent us packing. And let's just say things were frosty between Abram and me for quite a while. We settled to farm in the fertile lands of Canaan, and again God spoke the promise of offspring so numerous that to try counting them would be like trying to count the grains of sand in the desert. And still, month after month, I was without child. Seeds of doubt, of deep grief, of bitterness started to burrow into my heart. Do you ever slowly start to harden your hearts when the painful path seems like it will never end? Abram became this powerful figure in the region while I waited, beautiful but barren. And one fateful day as he prayed, I overheard him arguing with God. He was bemoaning my lack of children and challenging God's continuing promise of offspring. Whining, Abram was, that maybe God meant that the slaves he owned would be the heirs he was promised. I felt worse than nothing, unable to produce what Abram longed for, a son of his own, and so I started to wonder and consider if there was a way I could take matters into my own hands. Find a way to deliver the promised heir, even as I mourned my own barrenness. I owned a slave girl, Hagar. Maybe since I owned her, I could give her to Abram for a night and they could, and then since I owned her, the child would be mine too, and therefore we could make the promise of God come true. It didn't seem right. It didn't feel God. It didn't honor me or God or even Hagar for that matter, but it was better than constantly carrying this burden and shame, waiting for a promise that would never come true. And of course, Hagar got pregnant right away, underlining the fact that I was the problem. And of course, things didn't feel good, and the seeds of bitterness and doubt grew into fully fledged hatred and conflict as Hagar and I lashed out at one another. I beat her. and ended up throwing her out for dead with the child still in her womb. But God saw her misery and intervened again, and it seemed bringing her and the child back to the household. And it seemed like God gave her some strange kind of strength to tarry with us, despite harsh mistreatment. I often wonder why Hagar seems to this day almost to smile at times, carrying herself like a queen, a woman who's been promised much by God. My husband and I turned 99, and the months of waiting to discover if I were pregnant were long gone. My weathered, wrinkled skin reflected my weathered, wrinkled heart. Barely there anymore, my faith, as small as a mustard seed. Hagar's son, now 13, almost an adult, was clearly the way God's promise was going to be made true. But then one day something shifted that stirred me in a new way. Abram was praying again, and I was sitting close by, and as usual God spoke to us with the same old promise of exceeding fruitfulness and offspring, blah, blah, blah. But this time God spoke to Abram and gave him a new name, Abraham. It may not sound that different to you, but Abram in our language means exalted father. Nice. I always thought exalted father of Hagar's son. Abraham means father of multitudes. Nice, I thought. Hagar's son will be the conduit of multitudes. But God was not done speaking. As for Sarai, Sarah will be her name. I will bless her, and she will give rise to nations. Abraham laughed out loud and suggested to God that Hagar's son would be the better way to fulfill this promise, but God repeated himself and even said that I, Sarah, would physically bear a son, and that we should call him Isaac, which means laughter, which made me smile. I, Sarai, was now Sarah. In Hebrew, my name had changed by one letter, changing the word from the possessive form to the non-possessive form. Sarai means my woman of strength. Sarah means woman of strength. God was for the first time speaking to me and setting me before God as woman of strength in my own right, not simply a means to an end for Abram, not a woman who belonged to a man who had failed to give him a son, not someone who had to connive and manipulate to bring the promise of God to be, but, and it seems impossible, laughingly impossible, a woman of strength with my own promise from God. It would be over a year before my child was born, but I, Sarah, woman of strength, walked the difficult path now with a seed of faith that was growing day by day within me, as my child soon would. Sarah and Sarai live in each of us. We each have hopes and dreams that we long to see come to fruition in our lives and the lives of our communities and world. We each struggle with doubt and despair that can drive us to manipulate, coerce, tear down ourselves and those around us, especially now it seems. We each of us need to hear the promise of God that God will restore and revive us and bring about God's work and will in our lives without our manipulative striving, even if the way we finally get there was not the way we wanted it. Jesus speaks of this same process in the gospel, the way the disciples, Peter, had imagined God's promise of saving Israel was very different from the way Jesus was now talking. They had imagined a Messiah coming in glory and vanquishing the powers of evil, much like Sarai had imagined getting pregnant a few months after she married. It would be beautiful. They'd planned it all out, and it was clearly the way things should go. But now Jesus spoke of taking up a cross, that cruel instrument of torture and shame, and carrying it, No, Jesus, Peter cried, that cannot be the way. We must do it our way. No, Yahweh, Sarai cried, we can do it our way. Hagar can bear the child. Yet behind me, Satan, you are setting your mind on human ways and not God's ways. So often, my friends, our ways of solving our problems, our community's problems, our world's problems, are human ways. This Lent, with Sarah, with Peter, with Jesus, there's an invitation to trust the restorative path of God that paradoxically comes through picking up the cross and walking towards what seems like death, yet promises resurrection and new birth beyond our wildest dreams in ways that might even make us laugh out loud. Amen.